but it's because I'm fallible. And I'm prone to thinking that things are true sometimes even when they're not. And there's a good chance in the next 35 minutes or so that I'll be talking that I'll say one of those things and not even realize it. But you're fallible too. So there's also a decent chance that I'm going to say something that sounds false to you when I'm actually correct. That could happen too. So I'll ask that we just agree to do the best we can this morning with this topic. Now, usually if I'm presenting something at a philosophy conference, I'd be arguing for a very specific thesis, and I'd be giving very detailed arguments. But that's not what I'm going to do this morning. I'm going to try to talk about truth more from a big picture perspective and just make... That's all right. Tell me if I need to do something different. I'm just going to make some points. And I've narrowed it down to 6. We're going to spend on average about 5 to 6 minutes a piece on each point. You should have gotten a handout if you're on the lower level at least that's going to kind of guide you in taking notes. I encourage you to write down questions. You'll get to discuss this talk in your LA 101 classes soon. But I also invite you, if there's a burning question you would like my direct response to, my email address is at the top of that handout, and I would enjoy that. I'm hoping with these 6 points I just kind of spark some thought, maybe even some questions in your mind, and I hope maybe to even clear up a little confusion along the way too. Let's get going. Point number 1, we already know what truth is. Our difficulty lies in knowing what is true. We already know what truth is. Our difficulty lies in knowing what is true. Now, you might have expected a philosophy professor to get up here today and ask you this very profound, deep-sounding question: what is truth? I've heard people ask that. They usually have that like real intellectual tone in their voice when they ask it. The question was asked in the Bible too, I'm sure some of you know, to Jesus. But I've heard other people ask it, and it sounds so profound. But my own view is that that's not a particularly profound question. I think it's an easy question. What is truth? So easy, in fact, that I think most people who ask that question, they don't mean to be asking that question. They mean to be asking something else. I don't believe people literally mean to ask, what is truth? As if they don't even know what it means to call something true. We all know what that means. Let me show you. I'm going to give you a true-false quiz right now. Might be the first quiz you've had at Carson-Newman. Just 2 questions you can answer in your own mind. Don't say them out loud. Question 1, true or false? Your index finger is longer than your ring finger. Some couldn't resist the urge to answer out loud. All right. Here's question 2. Actually, if this one's true, I would like to hear you because I want to be your friend. True or false? You could easily afford to purchase a new Corvette this afternoon. If that's true, I'd like to be your friend. Now, those were easy questions. Of course, some true-false questions are much harder to answer than others. What I'm wanting you to notice here is what mental process you went through to answer those questions. I'll tell you what you didn't do. I bet no one in this room, when I said true or false, your index finger is longer, I bet no one thought to themselves, well, goodness, first I need to decide what truth is. I need to ask myself, what would it mean to call that statement true? And then I can answer that question. Nobody did that. I saw what you did. You looked down at your fingers. You compared your fingers. In other words, you looked at the reality of the situation. Same thing with the Corvette question. You thought about the reality of your bank accounts. And that's all truth is, really. It's reality. You could say truth is the property of accurately representing reality. It's not a great definition, but we're trying to define something so fundamental and basic, I think it's kind of pointless to try to define it. We know what truth is. We know what it is. but it can be really hard to know what is true. So that's just point number one. There's a lot of murkiness in our experience of the world, isn't there? A lot of confusion, a lot of conflicting information. And it's really hard to know sometimes what the truth is on a given issue. That's point number one. That's something we just have to learn to live with, that difficulty. It's hard. It's confusing. And so I think when people ask that question, what is truth? I think they really mean to ask, how do we find the truth? How do we decide what's true? Who can we trust as a source of truth? That's the sort of question I think they have in mind. That is a profound question. Point number two. Generally, truth is to be discovered, not created. Generally, meaning most cases, truth is to be discovered, not created. I've heard some people say that human beings are the creators of truth. I think that's a mistake, by and large. I think maybe why they get that idea is that humans are certainly very unique when it comes to truth. We're the only creatures around, so far as we know, that can express truth in very complex language. We can write truths down for others to see, for example. But we should not conflate our expression of truth with the creation of truths being expressed. Those would be two very different things. When we express truth, we're not literally creating truth. We're just expressing it. Here's a quick way, I think, to understand what I'm saying. And feel free to disagree and think critically, but also please think charitably about what I'm saying. Try to understand my point of view. I read that some scientists estimate there are 70 quintillion planets in our universe. Galaxies far from us, 70 quintillion. Quintillion, whatever that means. It means a lot. Now, I think it's kind of clear that there's going to be truths about each one of those planets. Lots of things are true about each one of those planets. Just imagine in your mind one of those planets that's so far away. We'll never, ever observe it in our earthly lifetimes. There's going to be truths about its mass, truths about its chemical composition, truths about its atmospheric conditions, if it has an atmosphere, and on and on and on. There's going to be all sorts of truths about each one of those planets. Lots of things are true about them. And yet, we have no way of discovering any of those truths because they're too far away, and we'll therefore never express those truths. And yet those things are still true. See, we don't create truth. At best, we can discover it, generally. I'm going to get to the exceptions in a moment. But most truths are like that. The truths you learn about in your science classes, for example, are truths that scientists have discovered, not created. I don't know the story of how this came to be, but at some point in the past, some scientists figured out that water was really a compound of hydrogen and oxygen. People didn't always know that, and then at some point they figured it out. But when scientists figured that out, they weren't creating that truth. Water had always been a compound of hydrogen and oxygen. They just discovered that truth, which is great. That's impressive. But don't get the idea that human beings are the creators of truth. And that means, here's an implication of that if we're going to be pursuers of truth, if we're going to be truth seekers, we have to humble ourselves. We have to be willing to accept truth as it is, because it's not going to conform to our preferences, our wishes. Again, generally speaking, I'm getting to the exceptions in a moment. It's generally not going to conform to our preferences. You might really want water to have been made out of something else, but it's always been hydrogen and oxygen. All right, what are the exceptions? Real quick, I'll give you an example. Right now, it is false that my right arm is raised. But watch this. I'm going to make it true. Me, myself, and I. How about that? It was false, and I made it true. Now, you can call that creating truth if you like. I think it makes sense to talk that way, because we do control some parts of reality. We can make things true that wouldn't be true if not for our actions. And I don't want to trivialize that control. I mean, I can do lots of things with these limbs and these vocal cords to do a lot of good or a lot of harm. But what I want you to notice is that in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of reality, you and I control a very small bit of it. That means we have only a very small, there's only a small portion of truths that are up to us to create. Most are there at best for us to discover. That was point number 2. Generally, truth is to be discovered, not created. Point 3, pursuing truth is not the same as pursuing certainty. Pursuing truth is not the same as pursuing certainty. One of the central lessons of studying philosophy, I think, is that there's very little we can be absolutely certain of. Now, due to time, I'm not going to take you through the tour of why most philosophers have concluded that, but if you've seen the Matrix movies or Inception, movies like those, you've already got the basic idea. Pretty much anything we believe can be subject to doubt. And if we're honest, we have to admit so many of the things we believe could be false. Now, there are some philosophers who look at that problem and they come away concluding that that means we should try not to hold many beliefs, really. Anytime we can't be certain that something is true, they say, we should suspend judgment. After all, how could it be rational to believe something that you recognize could be false? We call these people extreme skeptics, and some philosophers are extreme skeptics. Now, I think there are a few big problems with that view. I don't think you should be an extreme skeptic. I'm not an extreme skeptic. I'll take a few minutes here to explain one of the problems with that kind of skepticism. And this comes from the American philosopher and psychologist William James. He wrote this wonderful essay in 1896 called The Will to Believe. It says a lot of interesting things in that essay. I recommend it. But one thing he points out, this part's pretty simple. He says in truth-seeking, there are basically 2 goals. One goal is to believe things that are true. And the other goal is to avoid believing things that are false. Believe things that are true, avoid believing things that are false. Those are the goals. But what's interesting in his paper is that he points out those 2 goals actually exist in tension together. That means you can't pursue both of those goals fully at the same time. They pull against each other. Here's how I like to explain it to my students. Imagine you walk up to 2 people who are having a disagreement, and they're genuinely contradicting each other, meaning one of them has to be correct on this issue. And suppose you don't have a view yet on that issue, you've never thought about it before, and you hear the one person arguing for their side, and you hear the other person arguing for their side. What's the safest way for you to avoid believing the false view? Remember, one of them's got the true view, one of them's got the false view. What's the safest way for you to avoid believing the false view? What would you do if you wanted to really make sure you don't end up with the false view? Some of you might be thinking things like, well, you think very critically. You check their sources if they're making empirical claims. You test their claims for logical consistency, all that good stuff. I love that stuff. But no, the safest way to avoid having a false belief if you are totally sold out to that goal, the safest way to avoid the false belief is to form no belief either way. Think about that. You're guaranteed not to have a false belief that way. And that's what those extreme skeptics do on pretty much everything. They try not to have beliefs because they're so concerned about having false ones. And they do protect themselves from having many false beliefs that way. That's a very successful strategy for avoiding falsehood. But guess what else you avoid when you follow their approach? You avoid false beliefs, but you also, of course, avoid true beliefs, meaning you sacrifice your chance at having truth out of your aversion to messing up and making a mistake. That's why I think we should accept my point number 3. Pursuing truth is not the same as pursuing certainty. Certainty is not for us to obtain on pretty much anything. So if we're going to be truth seekers, we've got to be willing to pursue truth in the midst of uncertainty. Now, like many things I'll say today and have already said, I'd like you to try not to read more into what I'm saying than I have said. So here's an example. I did not just say that we should never suspend judgment and that we should always just form beliefs, whatever we want to believe as soon as we want to believe it. That's not what I said. Suspending judgment absolutely can be the rational approach in a given case, and some of us probably should make a habit of doing it more often. Too quick to form views sometimes. My point is just that you don't want to be the kind of person who has carefully thought about an issue. And it sure seems like something's true to you on that issue. You don't want to be the kind of person who's so afraid of messing up and having a false belief that you're unwilling to move forward with it. I say believe it if you're in that situation. You can change your mind later if you see you need to. But if we're going to pursue truth, we've got to be willing to take some amount of risk with our minds. And that's not something you hear people say much, so I thought that would be a fun one to share. Here we go. Point number 4. Truth seekers should expect and even welcome disagreement. That's what I think. Truth seekers should expect and even welcome disagreement. I want to share with you a quote from a contemporary atheist philosopher that I like, named Graham Oppy. It's not the kind of thing you're going to want to write down. Just let me say the whole quote, just kind of soak it in. Quote, "No matter what opinion you take on a widely contested question, it is almost inevitable that there are smarter and better informed people who have thought longer, harder, and more seriously about that matter than you, and who disagree with you." Think about that. No matter what side we've taken on a contested issue, he says there's going to be someone on the other sides who has thought about that maybe even more carefully than we have, and who's, let's just say, very, very smart and reasonable. I think that's just how it is. That's the reality of being human and seeking truth. That kind of disagreement is just there. So one thing I think that implies for us is that we probably shouldn't go around expressing our views like they're so obviously correct. Like people who disagree must be just idiots. No. There's going to be someone holding that opposing view who's far from an idiot. Someone who's actually a rather careful thinker, who's sincere in holding the other view. That doesn't mean they're correct. You could still be right, and they could be wrong. But I think it does mean that they deserve to be listened to and understood. That's what I mean when I say truth seekers should welcome disagreement. You want to hear from opposing views if you're a truth seeker. That's what I think. Another philosopher, John Stuart Mill, said this, nice little quote here. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. Meaning, basically, if you haven't made the effort to really understand opposing views and the most reasonable arguments and reasons that can be given for those other views, then you really don't understand what the good case for your view could be. Because part of having a good case for your view is being able to respond in a substantial way to the best case that can be made for the other view. That's why I think truth seekers need to welcome disagreement. You need to look for the reasonable cases that can be made for views that you disagree with and listen to them. Unfortunately, I think you guys have grown up during a time in our society where we're really moving more and more away from that. There's not an emphasis on listening to people who disagree, taking an interest in their views and their reasons, openly debating respectfully our various reasons. That's sad. And I'm not saying our society was ever great at that. It just seems like, man, we're getting worse. That kind of open and respectful disagreement just seems to be so rare. That is sad from like a human relation standpoint, but it's also really unfortunate from a truth-seeking standpoint. Because again, if you're a truth seeker, you need to grapple with that other view. But it gets worse, I think, in our society. Not only have we moved away from welcoming disagreement and inviting it and wanting to listen to it charitably and thoughtfully, I think there's been a big push recently in our society to suppress disagreement. Going beyond just not welcoming it, now we want to shut it up. We want to squash certain views from being openly discussed. Now, this is done in the name of, you've heard this, right? Keeping us safe. Keeping us safe from disinformation and misinformation. Just so you know, I never heard those terms as far as I am aware when I was in college. I'm going bald, but I'm not that old. But you guys hear those terms a lot, don't you? I'll just tell you, I don't like it. I don't like the idea of suppressing views in the name of safety. Now, can false information make us unsafe? Absolutely. Of course. It's obvious. But you know what else I think can make us unsafe? Is human beings assuming the power to determine, some group of them say, assuming the power to determine what the rest of us can and cannot freely say, express, discuss, and reason about together. That kind of power in the hands of any group of human beings is unsafe. But putting aside concerns of safety, this isn't a talk on safety, this is a talk about truth. If we want to pursue truth, sometimes we won't be so concerned with safety, be concerned with truth. And as I've said, that means needing to hear from those opposing views. That's what I think. Now, I'm checking the clock so that you don't have to, and it looks like we're right on track. So I'm going to take a few moments here to speak personally with you, if that's all right. I have very firsthand knowledge of what it is like, what it can feel like to have something you believe be labeled as dangerous misinformation. I'll try to be brief, but in a nutshell, during the pandemic, relatively early on, I came to the conclusion that the mitigations that were being so confidently urged on us, and in many cases mandated on us, I came to the conclusion that those mitigations were likely to do more harm in the end than good. That is, they were going to cause more suffering than they were going to prevent. I still hold that view. I think I was right. I could be wrong. You might disagree with me. I'm okay with that. I hope you're okay with that. But I sincerely held that belief. I sincerely hold that belief today. I think you guys should have been in school, for example, normal school, 2020. Some of you didn't get normal school till 2022, just as an example. Now, I could have been wrong, as I said, but views like mine were often labeled dangerous misinformation. Some of the things I believed were repeatedly called dangerous misinformation, anti-science, even fringe conspiracy theories. That was kind of a new situation for me to find myself in, believing things that so many experts and authority figures gave those labels to. That's kind of an uncomfortable place to be in. And it was really creepy, frankly, to see that there were people I thought very interesting, reasonable people who expressed some of the views that I held, and they were shamed, and they were censored and shadow banned and all that kind of stuff. That was creepy. But even worse, in my case, I was censored. But guess who censored me? I did. I'm the only person who censored me. There were many times when I was talking with people during this hard time for all of us. And it was clear in how they talked to me, or even just around me, or in their emails that I was on. It was clear that they just assumed that I thought what they thought about how to respond to this pandemic. It's kind of as if they thought that was the only reasonable view you could take. So, John, I think he's a reasonable person, so of course he agrees with this. That's kind of how it seemed. But I didn't agree. I very much disagreed. But many, many times I kept that disagreement to myself. I've already told you that truth seekers need to hear from disagreement. So I did a disservice to truth seeking by not expressing my views, but also did, I believe, a deep disservice to myself. That kind of self-censorship, not being willing to say what you believe in the right opportunity, that kind of self-censorship I think is bad for the soul. It was bad for mine. In fact, I think it was a big factor why I had a really severe mental health crisis in 2021. This was bad. If you're interested, because I know a lot of you struggle with mental health, I gave a talk at my church recently about anxiety and my experiences with it. If you email me, I'll send you a link to the recording to that. But just in a nutshell, I had severe anxiety and insomnia, and it was bad. I mean, I just couldn't sleep. I couldn't relax. I was in bad shape. And this was a big reason why I was censoring myself. That might not make sense to you, but I'm just telling you, I've been in counseling, and we've decided that seems to be one of the big things that got me so unnerved, was all the self-censorship and suppression. So I'm going to try not to do that so much anymore. That doesn't mean I'm going to go around getting in everybody's face every time I disagree with them. I disagree with you, I disagree with you. I just mean sometimes I need to be willing to express that disagreement, even if I'm wrong, which of course I might be. A nationwide poll recently found that college students, 80% of the college students that they surveyed in this poll say that they sometimes censor themselves on campus. They censor their views, are afraid to say what they think about something. 20% of the students in the survey say that they do this often. Those are the people I'm kind of talking to right here. I would encourage you not to do that. It's not good for truth seeking, and it's not good for us psychologically. Now, by the way, I can understand why some of you would feel that way. 1 in 5 of you, 20%, might feel that way. The very same poll, 66% of the students that responded to the poll said that it's okay to shout down a speaker on campus that you disagree with. If you think that what they're saying is bad enough, 2/3 of the students said it's okay to shout them down so that they can't express their views openly and so that people can't hear those views and think about them. So you can see why some of you might be a little hesitant to share things that you worry are unpopular. But again, I think it could do more harm to keep all that bottled in. Thanks for bearing with me there. Let me share that. Let's go to point number 5. Some truths are more worth pursuing than others. Some truths are more worth pursuing than others. I already told you earlier about the 2 goals, believing truths and avoiding falsehoods. Think about just that believing truth goal. If that goal meant believing a lot of truths, then you could be awesome at that just by going around collecting all sorts of mundane information. What did each person in the front row eat for breakfast this morning? I don't know. You don't know, but we could find out, couldn't we? How many holes are in my belt loop? I don't know. How long are my shoestrings exactly? How long are yours? She doesn't even know. Now, we could find out. There are truths to discover there. But should we? My point here is that to be a good truth seeker, I think we need to obviously want true beliefs, but we need to also think about what we're giving our attention to, our mental energies to. A nice portion of that should go towards thinking about really important topics, don't you think? What's true about those things? I'm not saying there's no value in truth as such. I think there is, but we're limited creatures. We need to make some judgments about what to spend our time thinking about and pursuing. Some truths are worth more pursuing than others. And we've reached the final point. Thanks so much for your attention. Number 6. Christianity, if true, is the most important truth of all. That's connected to that last one. Some truths are more worth pursuing than others. Christianity, if true, is the most important. Now, I recognize that Christianity is like a big religion, and Christians disagree amongst themselves about all sorts of things. So when I use the word Christianity here, I'm thinking of what you might call like sort of the core of Christian belief, just meaning the stuff that most Christians would accept. If that stuff is true, I'm about to share that core of the Christian faith with you. I think it's the most important truth that there is. So real quick, here I think is that core that most Christians agree on. Christianity says that human beings did not arrive in the world purely by a cosmic accident. In some form or fashion, and we might disagree on how he did it, we are created by an intelligent creator who wanted us here for a purpose. that Creator God expects certain things of us, His creatures. And those expectations are there whether we realize it or not, whether we like them or not. It's like that truth earlier that water is hydrogen and oxygen. That just is true. According to Christianity, our Creator expects things of us for how we live, not just in terms of our behavior, but He expects our hearts to be aimed at certain things. And those expectations exist whether we want them to or not, according to Christianity. We fail to meet those expectations, Christianity says. That's what we mean by sin. But our Creator loves us anyways. So much so, here's one of the really mysterious things about Christian belief. He loves us so much that He took on human flesh, Jesus Christ, to live among us, to dwell with us, to love us, to teach us. And, also super mysterious, I admit, Christianity says that God in human flesh died for us to reconcile us to Himself. I grant that is mysterious. Then Christianity says that Jesus was raised from the dead. And that's a sign of His deity, a sign of His trustworthiness. And the final piece of what I think this core of the Christian faith is, it says that the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, comes to dwell in those who are in Christ. And He seeks to work with each individual to transform them, to make them more like Jesus, to make them more loving, more honest, more charitable, in my case, more calmer, I think would be how you say that. Now, all that stuff I just said, that's like the core of what I mean by Christianity. Most Christians believe those things. That stuff's either true or it's false. And I'm almost done here. Point 6 was just that if it's true, I think it's the most important truth of all. Now, I think it's true. But if you ask me, Dr. McClellan, could you be wrong about that stuff? Could that stuff be false? I'll say, yes. Could be wrong. Could be false. Now that I recognize might not gel with your sense of what Christian faith should look like, but remember, I'm the philosopher. I think it's hard to be absolutely certain of most anything. So I'll admit, I could be wrong. I could be a dupe and believe all that stuff is true when it's not. But I do believe it's true, and in fact, I'm more confident about it today and in the last 2 years than I have been in a long time. But I could be wrong. But what if I'm not? What if I'm right? What if all that stuff is true? Man, that would open up a whole new world for some of you. Think of what that would mean. It would mean you're loved by the Creator of the universe, and He seeks to transform you. That's pretty awesome. Fill your life with purpose. So, in closing, whatever you believe about that Christian faith, you're welcome to pursue truth here at Carson-Newman and the many academic subjects that we offer. And I hope you'll really invest yourself in those. Ask the questions you really want to ask. Get in there, dig in. But I hope you'll also spend some time here thinking, reflecting seriously on whether that Christian faith is true. Because if it is, it's the most important truth that there is. All right, I made 6 points. We already know what truth is. Our difficulty lies in knowing what's true. Generally, truth is to be discovered, not created. Pursuing truth is not the same as pursuing certainty. Truth seekers should welcome disagreement. Some truths are more worth pursuing than others. And Christianity, if true, is the most important truth of all. Thank you so much for listening.